College football nerds, we're here talking Alabama and Arkansas. Josh is getting nerdy with me too, and I want to give you some homework and some reminders, and we're going to just jump right into it. First, homework in the comments. As usual, we've been doing this for years. Give us your score prediction. We're happy for you to tell us how crazy we were. Arkansas fans got at Josh last week to tell him how crazy he was, and he was kind of right. And also, we're just going to plug the live show. We do a live show every Saturday night, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 Central. It's actually a lot of fun. It's one of the things that we love doing the most on this show. We do a live top 10. We talk about the games that are going on right then. And you can check out obviously the replay of that on our YouTube channel or in podcast form. All right, Josh, let's get going on this one. The last time we talked was really about Alabama was, on the live show this weekend, but the week before, 2 weeks before after the Texas game, I kind of had some comments about Bill O'Brien's offense against Vanderbilt. And Arkansas fans, before you roll your eyes, against Vanderbilt, I was pretty impressed by what I saw. Went back and reviewed that game today. Josh, just get into it a little bit for maybe people who don't know the things that were plaguing Alabama, maybe against Texas or some parts last year that we saw in the game Saturday against Vanderbilt that should show signs of encouragement if you're an Alabama fan.
I think the biggest thing that should be a sign of encouragement is that the offense was actually operating on rhythm. Even in the early games like Louisiana Monroe or Utah State, I felt like Alabama's offensive production came a little bit out of rhythm, meaning Bryce Young was kind of creating more than he should. They had pressures even in their opener, certainly had a lot of pressures against Texas, and a lot of it was due to confusion. It was due to timing issues with receivers, due to receivers not breaking off routes properly or making correct checks. So if a guy's coming in a corner blitz, a lot of times the receiver is supposed to adjust his route, and he wouldn't do that. So that means Bryce Young gets the pressure without the release valve, stuff like that. But the biggest thing that really struck me in that Vanderbilt game is that the ball came out on time with authority to his receivers, and I really hadn't seen that from Bryce Young. And there were a lot of stats that got thrown up, and I think Bryce Young had been 1 of 8 on passes over 15 yards in the air going into the Vanderbilt game. And he started, it was like 4 of 4 or 5 of 5 or something like that in that game. And look, Vanderbilt is not a good team. They're a bad defensive team, but they're still a couple notches better than Louisiana Monroe or Utah State, more than likely. And so it says something that they played a lot better against Vanderbilt than they did those teams. So the biggest thing to me was just rhythm and consistency. And we talk a lot about how even when you have talent disparities, if you're not cohesive as an offense or a defense, you tend to play poorly. It's kind of the nature of football. It's sort of a weird aspect of it. And Alabama had not been there. So that kind of, in my view, turned the page a little bit. And I'll throw out one of the statistics that I had that I mentioned in our live show. Alabama already had some things going for them. I mean, in terms of running the ball, just off the bat, they were first in the country at about 7.5 yards per carry going into last week. So some things were operating. But the passing game, however you want to look at it statistically, they had a couple 6.5 yard per attempt games, a couple of them, and they just really, really took another step forward. So that's the biggest thing. Even against air, they weren't looking great, if you want to think of it that way. And they looked like they were operating correctly. And if they can operate correctly and take advantage of opportunities given to them through the air, suddenly that offense gets tremendously more dangerous.
Yeah, and look, Arkansas, if they wanted to score 45 points or 55 points, whatever the final score was against Vanderbilt, they could. Like that, I'm not saying that point total is some special thing. Vanderbilt's got a pretty good offense, I think, especially at wide receiver. I don't think they have a good defense. Is bad. The thing to me that I noticed that I mentioned in the live show is they were doing a lot of stuff that was non-standard for Alabama. Like they didn't score those points running their normal offense. They scored their points running the offense or calling plays that they were really working on. A lot of empty sets, a lot of RPO calls in the past, Nick Saban said. So from that standpoint, I think there's a lot of encouraging things because if they're working on the things they're bad at, I think we're going to see more of a more comfortable and normally called offense against Arkansas, which I think is going to lead to a good amount of points. Now, on the flip side, Arkansas's offense is what I was hoping was going to carry them this year, because you and I both have sort of had concerns for a couple years now on that defense. I think they've got some good players. They got some good pieces, especially Drew Sanders is showing out this year. They can be disruptive, but they can also give up some points and yards. And I don't know that the Arkansas A&M game was a huge indictment on that defense, but I do think that we're in some territory where, Josh, for Arkansas to be that top 10 team this year, didn't they need to kind of be like an Ole Miss of prior years where they might win a game 55-45? And does that give you a little concern about who they might be this year if they're not the team that can put the points on the board, but might be the team that will give up the points on the board?
Yeah, I think that's sort of the short version of it. Arkansas defensively plays physical football, but we talked about this a lot regard to last season, that they are not a great defense, and the pass defense in particular is not very good. What I see a lot from them is when they're playing downhill, they're pretty solid. They've got guys that can strike, particularly a linebacker with Sanders and Poole. I mean, they can hit and they can thump, and if they're filling lanes, they're good, and they can find the lanes and hit them. But the more that they start to have to redirect laterally, especially with the injury to Catalan, which I think really creates problems for them in trying to fill alleys, it just gets progressively worse and worse. And if teams could get the ball over to the second level where people are having to run them down, it just gets worse and worse and worse. Tackling is not great. Angles are not great. And so you do have to score a lot of points. But, to your point there, like that South Carolina game, which was 44-30, and Arkansas kind of came on really late in the game and blew it open. That was a 5.3 yard per play game. I mean, Texas A&M was 5.7, and I know they're a good defense. Cincinnati was 6.3. They have not been really blowing the doors off people offensively, and I think really the most consistently explosive weapon that I've seen from them has been Rocket Sanders. And I think in the passing game, like Hazelwood's shown up a little bit. They've got some weapons, but I think they're clearly missing what Treylon Burks brought to that offense. And they are relying a lot more on KJ Jefferson's ability to create than they'd probably like. And when you can contain that run game, or especially the sort of the zone read run game with Jefferson and Sanders, they don't have a lot of second options unless you're overly strained to deal with that. And so, yeah, I am a little concerned because I don't think the defense is fantastic. It's fine, but I don't think it's fantastic. And yes, I know they just shut down Texas A&M, but Texas A&M's offense is a whole other level of awful. So, you don't want to be in that position where your defense isn't great and you're maybe not that well equipped to win a shootout. And then you are in that position when you face Alabama, and it's a whole other different story, right?
Yeah, and I want to not so fast my own point too, because if you really look at that A&M game, what's kind of impressive from a yards per play standpoint, first of all, we love A&M's defense. We think it's very good. So scoring in the 20s against A&M's defense is not an indictment on your offense. I don't think that Arkansas's offense is elite, like maybe some people thought they could put up a ton of points this year. But I do think that A&M game wasn't an indictment, because if you think about it, they were 1 yard short of putting a touchdown on the board in that crazy play, and then they doinked a field goal at the end. Like, we're getting into, like, that's 31 points. That's really respectable in my opinion. So I think if I'm giving Arkansas a little bit of credit here, and the other thing that I'm going to segue to is, I think they scored 35 on Alabama last year. They've got the offense that when it gets going, it can get going. So I'm not super down on Arkansas, maybe for Alabama a little bit. But on the flip side, we've seen Alabama struggle in crazy, loud road environments, and specifically struggle offensively. So for all the goodwill that we're giving this Alabama offense and we have lately, isn't it a situation where, okay, maybe at home, if they're playing Arkansas at home, they can put up 50 points. But maybe on the road, it drops way down if we're using recent history, recent past, even going back to last year a little bit as a guide. Is this a situation where, we don't want to credit Alabama with a lot of points until they actually show us they can do it?
It's an interesting question because Alabama has been decidedly less effective on the road, and there are a lot of theories as to that. Our theory, I think, for both of us is they have issues in signaling the plays in a little late. And when they have a lot of noise, because they have so many checks offensively, given the time it takes for them to get the play in and given the amount of time it takes for them to get to the offensive line, they're constantly snapping with 6 seconds or less on the clock. And their offensive line just isn't great. So when that happens, they kind of constantly are snapping the ball when the defense knows it's coming. And when you lose that advantage in the offensive line to get the jump on the defensive line, it's extremely hard to pass block. So I do agree with you. It's hard to just take for granted that Alabama is going to be offensively the same sort of juggernaut that you think they might be. But, again, I mean, Arkansas, South Carolina to me is a pretty good benchmark, right? South Carolina had 4.4 yards per play against Georgia State. They had technically 4.8 against Georgia, though most of it was in absolute garbage time. And they struggled for quite a bit against Charlotte. And they had over 6 yards per play on Arkansas. So I think that's the tale of two sides here. Is I think offensively Arkansas did quite well. I mean, they were 9 yards per attempt against A&M. They didn't throw very much at all. They mainly ran the ball, but 54 carries for 244 yards at 4.5 yards per carry is nothing to sneeze at. That was a good Texas A&M defense, one that's been run on successfully some, and they had a lot of success on the ground. The problem to me with this entire discussion is we can talk about Alabama's offense and whether they take a step back, but I don't think Arkansas's defense is at the level of the ones that have given them fits. I don't think they're at the level of Auburn. Frankly, I don't know that they're at the level of Texas. Now, we could have a whole other debate about that. But Texas, when they play up to their talent level, can be very good. The problem with them is they just don't show up sometimes. The problem for Arkansas, to me, in this game is I think the Alabama defense does not get enough credit for just how good they actually are this year. And because of that, the bar that you have to hit defensively, what you have to hold Alabama's offense to is extremely difficult to hit. And so you've kind of got two competing things, right? Can you hold Alabama to enough points to be able to win? And on the other side, can you actually score? And doing those two things at the same time is, I think, kind of nigh on impossible.
Yeah, I do think that, we say this, but I was really impressed with Alabama's, their defense last year, and Arkansas still found a way to put some points on. So I do think there's some combination of, the powerful running quarterback with a strong arm and really maybe not caring if you lose and kind of throwing it all out there that puts Bama in a bit of a bind. One point about the Alabama defense that I think is really important, and I've noticed this for a couple of years now. Right now, Alabama is 5th in the nation in touchdown percentage, opponent touchdown percentage in the red zone. And that's huge to me because if you have an offense that can score a lot of points, then a defense that's holding other teams to field goals, it doesn't matter what yardage they get. If they're holding to field goals, that's huge. But if you have an offense that sputters a little bit on the road, what did we see against Texas? Field goal attempt after field goal attempt. That's what was the difference in the game. So let's get into the model a little bit. I know it's a little wacky, just like the Arkansas one last week. But let's do a quick one on the model, and let's get into some scores.
Yeah, so the model this week, for those that don't know, our model is a per-play model. Basically creates a sort of a description of your team, a description of the other team, makes them face off in a matchup-centric way. So Team A may beat Team B may beat C, C may beat A, the way our model works. It's not just a straight power rating or something like that. That's why we don't do a team ranking 1 through 130. And then based off how the game is expected to go, our model basically looks at your past history as a football team and creates a scoring model through sort of basically a machine learning concept, and kind of plugs in the data for both teams and spits out a score. This was a wonky game to run into the model because Arkansas actually has an inverted curve. And what I mean by that is that Arkansas has scored more points when they had fewer yardage. If you look through their history, their highest yard per play in FBS competition, we don't consider FCS games because that data doesn't really work, was Cincinnati, and they had 6.3 yards per play. In South Carolina, Arkansas actually only had 5.3 yards per play in that game. They got all their their points at the end of the game. Until then, they'd actually kind of sputtered off and on. And so because you have the situation where you scored more where there's fewer yardage, our model just takes everything at face value. And so it says, well, I guess they do better when there's fewer yards. There have been a couple instances where we've seen that, and it weirdly actually ended up being accurate. Daniel, I don't know if you remember several years ago, South Carolina, when they had Deebo Samuel, had this weird thing where they were scoring more points with low yardage, and there was this strange floor. It happened a couple times, and people laughed about our model, but it actually ended up being true that their points and their yards really had no correlation, and our model kind of saw through that and realized it had so much to do with special teams and defensive touchdowns and things that it was really, really wacky how the scoring model worked. But what I did in this one is I just sort of tweaked it, and I basically forced Arkansas's curve to go right side up by putting a data point to say, without affecting any other statistic other than that model and that curve, if Arkansas doesn't score any point or it doesn't gain any yardage, they're not going to score any points. And I basically anchored it low. So with that in mind, the yardage prediction, which I did not futz with at all, is about 8 yards per play for Alabama and about 3.5 for Arkansas. And that right there should tell you the whole story. Anytime a team is over 6 yards per play, they're generally doing whatever they want. Again, the higher watermark for Arkansas this year was Cincinnati at 6.3, and Alabama is 1.7 yards per play above that. I mean, 8 yards per play is just crazy. And on the other side of the ball, Arkansas is only expected to get about 3.5 yards per play. And the biggest problem is in college football, you can shut down the run. We often see teams that are dominant against the run, and Alabama is at that point. Right now, they are holding teams to 43% of their rushing averages. That is, I am fairly certain, the lowest number our model has ever recorded. We have seen teams in the 50s at the end of the year. Georgia was at that level. Alabama in 2016 was at that level. I think Clemson in 2018 was around that level in the 50s. I do not believe I've ever seen the number in the low 40s. So this should be we're only a few games into the season, but this is the highest rated rush defense our model has ever tracked. And then Alabama's pass defense is actually 73% of opponent passing averages. They had a bad quarter against Texas. A lot of that gets attributed to Ewers, which is one side that's a little screwy too, because we don't know how good Texas really would be, and Texas probably looks worse than they should compared to the production they got against Alabama because they haven't had the benefit of Ewers in some of the later games. But outside that, really that one quarter, which was with a different DB in, and they made a substitution, they've been extremely good. Anything below 75% is a lead in pass defense. It's hard to hold teams to much lower than that. Well, at the same time, Arkansas is 94% of opponent rushing averages, 190% of opponent passing averages. Those are bad numbers. That means basically teams are doing what they normally do. You're not really presenting much resistance. You're just basically a very, very average unit. And again, that's average, bearing in mind that most of your data points are not great. South Carolina and Cincinnati's data point is going to be sort of screwy because their averages are all based off G5 play. So yeah, that's really the tale of the story here. And when Arkansas, you consider the fact that they're a team that's almost 2-to-1 run to pass in terms of meaningful downs, and the fact that you can shut down the run and that Alabama does shut down the run, you get a really lopsided result. Our model has this 51-12, and it's because Alabama is expected to do everything they want to do, and it's because Arkansas is predicated on the run. They are not expected to be able to run at all. And last year's Arkansas A&M game or Arkansas Alabama game kind of turned into a shootout, mainly because Arkansas was hitting a lot of deep shots, mostly to Burks. The model doesn't see that this year, and without that, this game can get really, really lopsided really quickly. And our model doesn't really see an avenue for Arkansas to be able to win this game, given how much they, to this point, had to depend upon the run.
The flip side to this, though, is I don't think Alabama's getting 8 yards a carry. That for me, or not a carry, a play. 8 yards a play is a ton for a team that's not even averaging 8 yards against really bad teams. So I do get how, Arkansas is allowing maybe more than their opponent's average, but I also think some of that is the A&M data, that we're introducing here that's split between Haynes King and Max Johnson, and the offense has looked better. Even the running game has looked better with him at the helm. So I think that they're getting dinged a little bit for that in a way that maybe they shouldn't. But again, I don't think the defense is great. But I do think they can play above their heads if they're playing an Alabama team that's coming in and they treat it like their Super Bowl, kind of like Texas did, and the crowd is lathered up and they're really loud and they can put some pressure on Alabama. The issue for me, though, is I think some of what we've seen with Alabama 2 years in a row is you catch them early and they're a little disconnected. And we saw that with Florida last year and we saw it with Texas this year. What I'm seeing from Alabama this year, I wouldn't be surprised if they're a little sputtery on the road at Arkansas, but I think they're going to get theirs. Because the flip side of this, in terms of yards per play information and all that data, is people are going to say, well, yeah, Alabama played scrubs. Because ULM is terrible. Vanderbilt's not great, at least defensively. So I think that, Alabama's trying to salt the game away, basically taking a knee starting midway in the third quarter or earlier. So they actually could have done a lot worse against these teams. And on the flip side, it's very hard to hold bad teams to low averages. If they average 5 yards a pass, that's already bad. If they average 1 yard a carry, holding them to less than 1 yard a carry is impossible. So some of those numbers are skewed a little bit too. I've got Alabama 44, Arkansas 20. I think Arkansas is going to find some more points, but I do think they're going to struggle to actually score touchdowns unless they're doing it with some deep shots. And look, Arnold's a young corner. He can be exposed a little bit, but also, I don't see them having enough juice to beat Alabama. And I think this is the game where Alabama really shows that, it's funny to make jokes about Alabama sucking or maybe having all these issues, but at some point they usually flex their muscle, and I think they might do it here.
My prediction of the game is pretty similar. So I actually have it 41-17 Bama. And I mean, if you look at the point spread, it's 15.5, and it's gone actually up from 14 and more. So Vegas is asking the question, does Alabama win by 3 scores or 2 scores? And it's not saying that it's necessarily going to be in that specific realm. But if you're betting on this game and Alabama only wins by 2 touchdowns, they failed to cover. That says a lot. And I'm kind of with you. I think Alabama is very quickly rounding into form. Week 1, Georgia was head and shoulders the best team in the country. I don't think that's necessarily true anymore. I think Ohio State and Alabama are already at the point where they're going to give them a serious run for their money if they were to play today. And, Alabama, their worst game, that Texas game where their offense was really stagnant, was 5.9 yards per play. And that's a higher number than South Carolina averages on the year. Okay? So, their worst day against a good team is better than anything Arkansas has faced. And Alabama is averaging about 7.7 yards per play on the year, even including the Texas game. That number is 4th in the country. So I think Alabama and Ohio State are going to end up number 1 and number 2 on offense. It seems like they're going to be that number by a significant margin. I'm not sure if the crowd noise is going to be a factor, like you said. It's all so fragile in that things can kind of break for them offensively if they're out of rhythm, in terms of the receivers in the passing game, which does happen with Bryce Young. Same thing we said with the Texas game. That was the route for Texas to stay in it, and it happened. But a lot like the Texas game, and I think maybe even more so, if Alabama had been in rhythm in the passing game, that game probably would have gotten really ugly, given where the offense was for Texas. And, Texas hit a couple deep shots that gave them some points early, and outside those, they didn't really do much of anything. And so that's why I think this game is probably going to be pretty out of hand. I think Alabama is that good. And I think Arkansas's 3-3-5 scheme is the last thing I want to end on, is going to run into some significant problems because Alabama's offensive line is not great, but Arkansas doesn't really rely on as many big defenders at the line of scrimmage as other teams do. They walk Drew Sanders up a lot and rush him, but I'm not sure that's going to be as effective as Texas, that had at all times two guys that were high-level talents. Texas has a really good defensive line. That's the strength of their football team, that were getting interior pressure. It's hard to do that when you're a little bit undersized, which Arkansas is. And given that, again, Alabama is the top-rated rush team in the country, very quietly, that's a problem for a 3-3-5, just like we saw last year with Ole Miss and we saw it with Cincinnati. And Arkansas, I think, last season really played by being very aggressive to try to stop the run and got burned over the top. I could see them trying to do the same thing, and they could give up just as many yards and just as many points this year. The difference is I think Alabama's defense is in a much better place than they were, and I don't think Arkansas's offense is quite as good as they were. So you could see sort of a similar game in my view, but without Arkansas being able to score to keep up. And this could kind of get out of hand very much in the way the last Alabama and Arkansas game did last year, where Arkansas just barely kind of kept hitting those big shots, and it was always right on the cusp. It felt like of Alabama pulling away. My prediction is that this year that probably does happen. But we'll have to see. We still haven't seen Alabama put together a big game against a really good opponent. I get it. But we're also 4 games into the season, and Alabama only has one game where the offense wasn't 8 yards per play. So it's not crazy to think that they're going to be really on fire again. And if that happens, I think the paradigm for Arkansas and for Alabama is going to shift dramatically. Probably somewhat fairly for Alabama, but I think very unfairly for Arkansas, because I think people just have that Texas game in their mind. They see Alabama as a team that's really struggling and doesn't have it together. And I think the reality is by the end of the year, we're going to realize that they're probably going to end up being the team that we expected them to be.
Yeah, and the flip side of Alabama being a good run offense is they're third in the country in run defense behind probably some skewed statistics. James Madison, number 1, Rutgers, number 2, at 1.84 yards per carry. So that might be a challenge as well. All right, y'all, that's it for us on Arkansas and Alabama. Let us know in the comments what the score is going to be. And let us know what you think about Alabama on the road. Are those woes going to continue? Are they still going to be herky-jerky? Or do you think they're going to sort it out on the road against Arkansas? Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.